Mochi Health is here to help you start your weight loss journey with caring, personalized support. Meet one-on-one with board-certified obesity doctors and registered dietitians who truly listen and understand your unique needs. Eligible patients can access affordable GLP-1 medications delivered right to their door each month. No insurance? No problem. Mochi Health accepts FSA and HSA, making care accessible and affordable. And with 24/7 customer service, you'll never feel alone on your path to better health. Get started with Mochi Health today. Take the free quiz at joinmochi.com and use code AUDIO40 at checkout for $40 off your first month of membership. That's joinmochi.com with promo code AUDIO40.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my unsilentable co-host, Brett.
Don't know if it's a word, but I love it. Can't silence me.
Definitely not a word.
Those are the best ones.
It's not a word, but it's true. Even though it's not a real word, you know exactly what I mean. And by the way, that's very similar to the law. A lot of times the people have no idea what the law means. And what do judges do? They interpret the spirit of the law. So you are interpreting the spirit of what I just said, which is true. Brett, we have all tried to get you to be less verbose, to maybe stop talking sometimes, and it's impossible. Even when I tried to save you from yourself and stop you from telling people how to kill people with axes, bury people alive, you continue to talk. So you are unsilenceable, and everyone knows exactly what I mean. And this is very on point today because we are talking about gag orders. What are they? Are they allowed? Are they constitutional? Why are they used? When can they be used? We will touch on all of those things and maybe answer some of them.
And I think all of you have heard of gag orders at this point, and I feel like until the last couple of years, they were pretty rare. But now I feel like we see them all the time. They really are coming along. And I think one of the reasons for that is the explosion of true crime. I think true crime podcasts, true crime YouTubers, there's just so much more information that's getting out there, both true information and misinformation. And I think judges are much more cognizant of that and have started being pretty aggressive in imposing these orders that in many ways seem to run counter to our most sacred, fundamental principles as a country. And since they are, in a lot of the cases that you hear about, we figured, hey, let's talk about these and see whether they're constitutional or not.
And what Brett's talking about is all the time we hear, we have the right to free speech. Where does that come from? But obviously, if you've followed us long enough, you know that that right of free speech is not forever, right? There are obviously limits to speech because there are some types of speech that actually impinge on others' constitutional rights. And so the very core principle is, what are we talking about? Of course, we're talking about free speech, which is embodied in the First Amendment.
And the funny thing, I mean, we all love the Constitution. Alice used to carry it around in her pocket in case one of her professors quizzed her about it.
That just gave me an idea. I really did do that. I think a lot of people did because we were nerds. We should get little pocket constitutions as giveaways.
I love it. It's a
with
great
like a little
idea.
Prosecutors University at the bottom. Guys, the next
That's
time
awesome.
you see us like in person, we'll have prosecuzis and maybe pocket
By Crime Con,
constitutions.
we're going to have pocket constitutions.
By Crime Con. Because
I love
guys,
it.
that's also like a civic duty to let people know their rights. What's up?
I love it. As awesome as it is, it doesn't actually let you know your rights because the Constitution was written 200 and, I can't do the math, 35 years. That's the Declaration of Independence.
You got it, almost.
That's the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution was 1789. It was ratified? Or 1787?
1787
Was
to
that 1787?
1789.
Okay, whatever.
87 to 89.
We're showing our ignorance now. Sorry, guys. Anyway, the Constitution, written a long time ago, a couple of hundred years ago. And in the time that followed, there has been a lot of interpretation and change. And just to give you an idea, we're going to talk about the First Amendment a lot here. And you think of the First Amendment as this robust protection of your right to speak, your right to criticize your government. And yet, the same people who drafted and ratified the First Amendment also passed laws in Congress that criminalized criticism of government, the Alien and Sedition Act. Today, it's impossible to even imagine something like that being constitutional. But what it means to have free speech has developed a lot over all of that time. You weren't right, Alice, because you said 1776. Alice is bragging about saying 1787 in the chat room. So
I was right the second time.
And you really see that with what we're going to talk about today. But this really is grounded, like Alice says, in the First Amendment. And the First Amendment, broadly speaking, protects the rights of Americans to do a lot of different things. There are 5 rights embodied in the First Amendment. Let's see if we can get them all. So the right to free speech, the right to freedom of religion, the right to freedom of the press, the right to assemble, and the right to petition your government. I think I got them all. Those are all embodied in the First Amendment. And generally speaking, a lot of them, religion is sort of different, but petitioning your government, assembling, the press, free speech, they've all sort of collapsed into one overarching idea that as Americans, you should be able to say anything you please without fear of repercussions from the government. Can't be arrested, you can't be fined. No sort of government power is going to come down on you because you decide to exercise this fundamental right. And I'll just tell you that a lot of you who are not listening in the United States, that's foreign to you. Even countries that are very free, countries that would probably argue they're freer than the United States. A lot of them, when it comes to speech, the rights are much more circumscribed than they are in the United States. In fact, speech may be the place where the United States has the broadest freedoms imaginable. And you can think of restrictions on speech in different ways. And the most disfavored is something called prior restraint. And a prior restraint on speech is telling someone they cannot speak. They cannot say something, and that is highly suspect. And it's looked at in a different way than you can speak, but if you say something, you may be punished for it. And you can argue about where that line is drawn. Obviously, if the punishment is pretty severe, even a post-speech restraint can be seen as a prior restraint because it's going to chill speech. And so when you're looking at things that aren't prior restraints, chilling of speech is something people look at. But we don't even have to get into that because today we're talking about prior restraints. We are talking about this idea of telling someone, even though you live in the United States, and even though this is a fundamental right, you cannot speak. And as controversial as that may seem on the surface, there are actually some pretty non-controversial examples of this. So before we get into the controversial ones, just some examples of this. So there are national security letters that prevent the recipient from discussing certain sensitive issues. So imagine you have some sort of information that is critical to national security. There are all sorts of restrictions on you and your ability to talk about that. You know, I have a top secret security clearance. Occasionally I will hear information that I can't share. I can't talk about it. Right? And if I do, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble for that. A lot of times, if there's an investigation that involves national security, when information is requested from someone, that will include a letter that says, hey, we've asked you for this information. This is highly sensitive information. You cannot discuss the fact that we asked you for this. And those letters you actually see in more context than just national security. National security is a particularly sensitive one, but even pretty simple subpoenas, like to a bank, for instance. If I send a subpoena to a bank, I include a letter that says, hey, don't tell the person that we're asking for their information that we asked for it. And if you do, there can be criminal penalties associated with that. And there's a lot of subpoenas and search warrants that include what is a prior restraint that tells people who are in receipt of those, you can't talk about these.
Absolutely. And you guys can understand why those are relatively uncontroversial, right? National security, because it could affect national security, of course. With those kind of criminal subpoena contexts, you can imagine it could compromise an investigation, and the law had weighed the costs and benefits of this prior restraint. The bank It's just their documents, right? All they're doing is not telling someone. Whereas if they told someone, it could compromise an entire investigation, and continued criminal conduct could be the result of that action. Now, while these examples that Brett just talked about are pretty non-controversial and we can get it behind, and in fact, we do get behind them. They are laws that are enforced, and if we were to get a letter like that, we could understand what the basis was for that prior restraint. But what is controversial are gag orders on parties in a lawsuit. These orders tell the parties, the attorneys, and even related third parties that they cannot speak to the press. So basically anyone touching the lawsuit, not just the attorneys, not just the parties, but kind of all who are involved with this lawsuit, can't talk to the press. Now, fundamentally, you should have a gut reaction like, that sounds like it shouldn't be the case, because I thought you've told us before, Brett and Alice, that the courts are supposed to be open. It's supposed to be the judiciary for the people. You're supposed to be able to walk into any courtroom unless it's sealed, and the default is that the courtroom is not sealed, that you can walk in as a public citizen to watch what is happening with your government, right? With the judiciary. You get to watch a case, even if you're not part of the case. You get to watch from the gallery. So how can it be that a court system that was envisioned to be open to the public be available for this gag order where people can't talk about it? That means the press can't report about it if they have no sources. So it's worth taking a moment to differentiate between this and telling the press that they can't report on something. This, the government is restricted from doing. So there's been a lot of lawsuits about this, about not being able to tell the press that they can't report on something. So even if the press receives information that it shouldn't have, the government can't prevent it from publishing. So think about leaks. This is why leaks are such a big deal, right? Snowden leaks, whether it's national security. If the newspapers or the reporters get this information and they're not the ones to have stolen it in the first place, the government can't really keep them from reporting on it. Now, this has been the subject of a lot of lawsuits, and that's how we have come out today. But what the government can do is it can force those journalists to give up their sources on pain of contempt. So they can say, we can't keep you from reporting it. There's free speech, but you have to tell us where this came from, because a leak could be continuing. It could cause real harm to the government, to national security, etc. And the press often works with the government on issues of national security. So you'll often see these situations where there are government leaks, and it could be a situation where if they were to release that information, they have a right to do so, but it could compromise real military lives abroad, for example. They'll typically work with the government and say, hey, we have this information, we're going to publish it, but we're cognizant that this could cause real harm to real people. So we'd like to work with you. We still want our story, but we want to do it in a way that's responsible journalism.
And I think the average American would be surprised at how often that happens, that the government will find out, usually from the press, a lot of times, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the big ones, that they have some sort of information that unclear exactly how they got it, but they will often contact the highest levels of government and say, hey, we've got this and we're planning on reporting on it. And they want to know, like, if we report on this, what are the consequences going to be? You say it's going to compromise national security. What does that mean? Are people going to die? Or is this going to embarrass you? Because if that's it, we're going to report on it. Or people are going to lose their lives over it. And a lot of times, either the press will leave things out, they will delay reporting. Sometimes, on rare occasions, they won't report at all. It's one reason that even though various administrations often have pretty serious problems with the press and don't like what the press is doing, they want to work closely with them to make sure they have the kind of relationship where they can have that candid conversation. The other side that Alice mentioned is if someone leaks information improperly, members of the press can be held accountable for that, in that they can be required to release their sources. Because this is such a sensitive thing, there are really stringent requirements in the government before you arrest a member of the press. Obviously, you don't want to be seen as impinging on free speech, but it can become important. There was a circumstance during the Bush administration where I think it was a New York Times reporter, but it could have been a Washington Post reporter. In any event, she had received information and I believe spent about a year maybe in jail because she wouldn't give up her source. And I think eventually her source actually released her from the obligation not to share it. And so she was able to share it, and it became not so much an issue. Jason Blair says it was the New York Times. It was Judy Miller who did that. So that can be something that happens. That's obviously a really sensitive circumstance. I've told the story before, but I once had a reporter who was trying to get a piece of information out of me, and I wouldn't give it to them. And they said, "I will go to jail for you." And I was like, well, that's great. I'm glad that you're that committed to this, but I'm just going to keep this one to myself. So that is
no
sort
one's
of
ever said they'd go to jail for me, so good on you.
Yeah, there's a lot of play
that
back
conversation,
and forth.
Brett, though, because I think you were texting me during it.
Yeah.
We both knew the information, except no one was going to go to jail for me. They should have called me. I would have given it up.
Yeah, there you go. See, if you're out there in the world, Alice is the one to talk to. So, gag orders, though, as we said, despite the fact they have this questionable status, they're getting more and more popular, and we're seeing them in more and more of these high-profile cases that we talked about. As Alice said, the Supreme Court has found that Americans have a right to access the courts. The court cannot hide what is going on within its walls, and it's not just the right of the people to see it. It's the right of the accused to have their trial take place in open court. We talked about this. People asked us in Delphi, well, what if the judge decides just to have a secret trial? Can they do that? And the answer is no, they can't do that. You can keep a lot of things secret for a long time. You can have things in the trial where you saw this in the Murdaugh case, where evidence is being presented to the jury that's highly sensitive. And even though that was a televised trial, the photographs of the victims, for instance, were not allowed to be shared over the television. The jury saw them, but you have that restriction. And these sort of reasonable restrictions on this are something that the courts have always said are fine. But keeping the courts open is a fundamental right that we all have. And so the way courts have handled this is you have that open court thing. Everything's going to come out at the trial. So it's not necessarily about keeping things a secret. It's about ensuring that the accused has a fair trial and ensuring that pretrial publicity doesn't interfere with that. So this right you have both to open courts and to speak is counterbalanced by another right. And this so often happens in these complicated questions. It's really two rights bumping up against each other. So the accused right to a fair trial that isn't prejudiced by the press, with a jury that can be trusted to weigh the evidence, runs up against freedom of the press and freedom of speech. And that's where gag orders have come in an attempt to balance those two rights.
And so you can imagine that all sounds great, but how do you actually put this into practice? How do you balance these competing interests? And so, like the Supreme Court often does, it tries to lay out some sort of standard by which lower courts can follow. And the Supreme Court began working this out in Nebraska Press Association versus Stewart, which is a case from 1976. In that case, the court allowed a gag order on a newspaper only when the court could show three things. One, whether the publicity would harm the defendant's right to a fair trial, whether the gag order is the least restrictive means to ensure that fairness, and third, whether the gag order will be effective. And that all fundamentally makes a lot of sense, right? We talked about the core competing interest with these gag orders. The reason you want a gag order is to ensure a fair trial. But you can't just have that be the only reason. This is kind of a lot of times we've talked about how in appeals, when you're pointing to wrongdoing by the lower court or by not turning over documents or newfound information or something the defense counsel should have done, it's not enough to show that something could have been done, right? So it's not enough here to show that the defendants might have an unfair trial because of what's reported on. We've always said there has to be a showing that it actually does the thing you're afraid it's going to do. And that's what the Supreme Court is baking in here. It's saying that there are ways to ensure that you get a fair trial, and a prior restraint is so restrictive. Is that the only way we can accomplish it? Is there something else you can do? Can you sequester some sorts of things? For example, you can redact a document instead of just withhold the entire document from the public view, right? The purpose of redacting is that you're removing the most sensitive information, but there's still some idea of what's going on. So is the gag order the least restrictive way of doing that? And another thing, is it going to be effective? Because you can imagine a world where, okay, the press can't report on it, but Reddit has all of the information. It's already out there. There's like no way to kind of, unring that bell. Are you doing anything that the public doesn't already know? That's a really interesting question. So it's not just that it's the least restrictive means, but is it going to do what you want it to do, which is to ensure a fair trial?
And this is really a fascinating topic. We talked about all this for a long time, but effectiveness is an interesting question. And Delphi, it's hard to get away from Delphi. So as we have discussed, the secrecy measures in Delphi are far beyond anything we've ever seen. One tool you can use, Alice was talking about other tools, is sealing documents. Like you can seal sensitive documents. So most documents are public, but if there's a really sensitive document, we're going to seal it. But as we've seen in Delphi, they seal everything. Like the exception to the rule is the public gets to find out. And they had a very broad gag order. And what did you see happen in response to the broad, restrictive gag order? What did the defense do? They filed a legal document, which was essentially a press release that accomplished speaking to the public without actually speaking to the public. There's a lot of interesting things tied up in that. Is that ethical? Is it ethical to intentionally avoid a court order in a way that that's exactly what you're doing? Like you could not go out and tell the press this, but you can file something with all the information in it. On the other hand, if you can file something with all that information in it, why can't you tell the press about it? Is it effective to have this gag order that's violating some fundamental rights, or at least restricting them, when you can accomplish the same thing through a filing? Does that mean the Delphi order is overbroad? Overbreadth is something you talk about a lot in the Constitution. And basically what it means is there are restrictions that are allowed on your rights. No right is without limit. None of them. But if the restriction, even if it has a good purpose, a valid purpose, if it's overbroad, if it sweeps in too much stuff, it may be invalid. It may need to be narrowed. And one way maybe that works in this context is when it's very easy to avoid it through other measures. That may mean it's not effective. And the problem you have there is, imagine Delphi. You have all these people who are restricted from speaking. The family, they don't have a method to speak. They can't just file something with all their views in it. But they're swept up in this too. But the defense attorneys can. So does that mean it's unfair in that way? And you can see how all these things start to run into each other. The other thing, we just told you can't restrict the press from publishing something. But then we just gave you the test for how you restrict the press from publishing something. What's up with that? Well, really, part 2 of that test is essentially fatal to gag orders on the press, and it's the least restrictive means. This is another thing we talk about a lot when we talk about constitutional rights. We're trying to accomplish something that is a valid goal and something you're allowed to do. Are you accomplishing that? Sort of goes along with the overbreadth. Are you accomplishing that in the way that restricts the rights of people the least? So if we're going to restrict rights, we really want to do it the very minimum amount necessary to accomplish our valid goal. We talked about this way back when we talked about feeding people in the park, right? And we're restricting people from feeding people in the park. Is there a way to do it narrowly that accomplishes your goal of ensuring that not all the trash is piling up and it doesn't become sort of a campsite for the homeless, but allows people to perform these actions they want to perform, feeding the homeless? Is there a way to do that? Just banning it across the board feels overbroad. It feels like that's not narrowly tailored. So what the courts have said is, look, if you're going to impose this on the press, it has to be this narrowly least restrictive means possible to do it. And basically, there is a less restrictive means, and that's gag orders on the parties. So a gag order on the parties has become the fallback for courts because they feel like we can't tell the press, don't publish it, but we can tell people, don't tell the press. And so this is a less restrictive means that you can use to accomplish the same end. And that's why you see so many gag orders on parties. Now, look, it doesn't mean you can just do it willy-nilly. There are certain requirements. They're all over the place. Every court in the country has a different standard. But generally speaking, you have to show, look, there's a real danger of prejudice if this is discussed broadly in the press, prejudice to the defendant or the fairness of the trial overall. We want to avoid that. The order has to be narrowly tailored to those parties, so back to narrow tailoring, to prevent the prejudice. So you can restrict them as much as necessary to prevent the prejudice, but don't go over that. And of course, look to a number of factors to determine whether or not the gag order is narrowly tailored, including the scope of the order, exactly what it prevents the parties from revealing. You might narrow it to say the parties can't discuss anything in discovery. The parties can't discuss anything that witnesses are going to testify to at trial, but they can talk about sort of how the family's feeling. They might be able to explain to the press exactly what's going on. They might be able to give their position on the timing, like that kind of thing. But we're going to restrict you from saying substantive stuff. All sorts of ways to do this, and you see different ones in the different cases we've looked at.
So this is really interesting, moving to gag orders on parties. And the case that established the use of gag orders on parties and participants was that of the trial against Dr. Sam Shepard for the murder of his wife. So this case was one of several trials of the last century, and the Supreme Court would describe bedlam as reigning over the courthouse. I think we can use that same descriptor for quite a few trials that we've seen recently and probably a few to come. Now, in that case, the Supreme Court said a gag order imposed on the trial participants, quote, might well have prevented the divulgence of inaccurate information, rumors, and accusations that made up much of the inflammatory publicity, at least after Shepard's indictment, without a corresponding curtailment of the news media. So the court noted that due process, quote, requires that the accused receive a trial by an impartial jury free from outside influences, and that neither prosecutors, counsel for defense, the accused, witnesses, court staff, nor enforcement officers should be permitted to frustrate its function.
And there's a lot you can draw from that. Number one, the Shepard case is a case we should cover. Talk about a famous case. And those of you who've seen The Fugitive know it's, the television show was loosely based on this. The movie was loosely based on it. Great case that we should talk about more, but one that led to a lot of development in the law. And you see this in a lot of places. Think back to Murdaugh, right? Why is it we're so concerned about whether or not the court clerk may have influenced the jury? Well, as the court says, the jury needs to be making its decision free of outside influences, and that includes court personnel. And we're going to see more of that in a couple weeks when they have the evidentiary hearing. They're going to talk about this kind of stuff. And all of this, I think, is intuitive in a lot of ways. Like when you read what the Supreme Court says about this stuff, you're like, yeah, this makes sense. But it doesn't, at least for me, remove an icky feeling, because it's one thing to restrict the parties or court personnel or the police. It's another thing to restrict non-parties or even the victims, to tell the victims in a crime that because someone has now been charged with your loved one's murder, you can't talk. And that's one of the reasons we're doing this. I was listening to True Crime Garage, and they were talking about the Delphi case. And Nick was talking about how he ran into Becky Patty at CrimeCon. And one of the things she said was how hard it was to not really be able to talk about the case because of the gag order that they're under. And to me, that feels really unfair. And while the courts have addressed this in a lot of ways, they've talked about it broadly, the Supreme Court has never addressed this question in particular. How far does this go? What exactly can the courts tell victims and non-parties, and maybe people who will never even testify? They're not going to be witnesses. How much can a court tell them about what they can and can't say? Judges absolutely think they have this power. They believe they have this power. We've seen this kind of order in Delphi. We've seen it in Idaho. In Idaho, the media and the family actually fought back against a gag order, and they were successful in some ways in narrowing, though they did not eliminate the gag order. And when you read what the judge said, to me, it highlights a lot of the problems with these gag orders because the judge tried to narrow it. But when you read the language, who knows what that means? The judge uses a lot of broad, vague language about what people can say and what they can't say. And it gets back to that whole idea of chilling speech. Even if you have the right to say it, if the judge has been so vague about your rights, you may not know that. And how can you know it? And to me, I hate these. I hate gag orders. I think they're generally terrible ideas. And the broader they get, the worse they are. It's one thing to tell the prosecution and the defense you can't talk about it. Frankly, the prosecution and the defense, at some point before a trial starts, I mean, once the trial starts, I think it's a little different. Trying your case in the press, I get why people do it, but it's a little, I don't really like it. There are rules of conduct that we're all under about it and how you do it. So I think we're already restricted. Gag orders are fine. But once that gag order starts to broaden and the judge starts to expand the scope of who they're going to tell, what they can say, and who they can say it to me, I get a lot of icky feelings about that. And I think, given how much we're seeing this and how many cases we're seeing it in, I hope this is an issue that trickles its way up the courts, because I think we need something far more definitive on what courts can do, because I think it's getting out of hand. I think courts are overstepping their legitimate authority to restrict what people say when it comes to these cases.
Yeah, I think that's right, Brett. I think with kind of the rise in interest in a lot of true crime cases and a lot of these cases that are now getting such international attention and part of kind of 24-hour news cycles, it does cause a lot of pressures and stresses on the judges that are overseeing these cases. And I think it's such a new issue and a new problem to have kind of armchair detectives questioning every move and maybe even going so far as to threaten the judges or the people who are part of these cases, that the court is still kind of stuck back in the tools that they're able to use to control their courtroom, because now all of a sudden their courtroom is not just their physical courtroom. Suddenly, when you have 24-hour broadcast of all these cases and filings, torn up across social media mediums and kind of dissecting every single word of every order and what dockets mean and getting things wrong. I certainly feel the pain of the judge not being able to control their courtroom, but I think the reaction in a lot of these high-profile cases has been the wrong one, which is to slash back with a sledgehammer, which is the gag order, in situations that are just not appropriate for it, against people who it shouldn't be applied against. And, this is very relevant for today. I was coming upstairs getting ready to have today's recording on gag orders, and it reminded me of the latest meltdown in my house. The one surefire way to get my kids to have an utter meltdown is if I silence them. Right? I don't let them explain what's going on. So I know someone has hit somebody and there's toys all over and something bad has happened. They've broken something and everyone's crying and screaming, and I walk in and they both start talking. And if I say, no, everyone shut your mouths, no talking right now, that will just take everyone into a tailspin, because they're not able to express themselves and kind of tell me their side of the story. And I think that about myself. One of the things, it's been a lot of practicing in front of different courts, and I've been yelled at by lots of judges, lots of attorneys, lots of witnesses. I'm kind of used to being yelled at. There are very few things that actually rattle me in court, but one of the things that really does rattle me is if a judge asks me a question and then has decided what they want the answer to be, and I know it's the wrong answer, and they don't let me answer, and they say, counsel, I don't want to hear your answer, even though they've asked me the question. Nothing gets me more worked up than when I can't speak. And that goes to the fundamental problem I think we all feel with gag orders. You can imagine the last time you were forced to be silent about something, and think about the most grave injustice thing that you could imagine, not just be quiet or in a movie theater, right? Something that bears your viewpoint, but you're not able to express it. And as a result, there is a narrative happening that is not informed by your viewpoint. And that gets under all of our skin. And that's why we have a country founded on free speech, because we value that. So I think we have just spiraled into kind of a situation that is uncharted territory, and we're going to see only more and more of it. And I do think it's going to come to a head at some point. And I hope that we really take a hard look at gag orders and whether they are They should be as widely used as we've seen them used. And it shouldn't be the default that just because it's a hotly, followed case, that those are the ones that gag orders are imposed on. That's not fair, because the victims in Delphi and Idaho, they didn't choose to become an international sensation. There are lots of cases like them. We've talked about this. Why do some cases kind of catch fire across the media and some are relatively unknown, even though they are cases worthy of attention? So I think that should not be the metric by which we apply gag orders. And there's a lot more thought to be put into when we apply them and whether we want them to be used in the criminal context, for example, and against victims and against family members and non-parties. So a lot more to discuss, but this is kind of just scratching the surface.
And Daphne's asked a question about whether or not victims would be able to talk to a therapist. Remember, the point of the gag order is to ensure a fair trial for the defendant. So that is the competing right. So the gag order is tailored to that. You talking to a therapist is not going to have an effect on the trial. Now, the therapist goes and talks to the press. You probably sue that person later on, but you would be able to do that. But the fact you asked the question, I think, goes to a problem with gag orders like we're talking about. Because they are so broad and because they're so vague, it's easy to feel like I can't talk to anybody about anything. That's what this means. It's not what it's supposed to mean, but it can make you feel that way. And this is the problem with restrictions on speech, is they always end up chilling it in a way you don't intend. I don't care how good your intentions are when you tell somebody they can't say something. I don't care what it is they're saying. You are going to chill speech when you do it in a way that is going to have really negative consequences. And I can imagine a victim feeling like, man, if I tell my therapist how I'm feeling, am I violating the gag order? Am I going to go to jail? Yeah, and that's a problem with these. And another reason I think the courts need to rein this in, and the fact that judges feel comfortable because when you put a gag order in place, what you're telling someone is, if you do this, I will put you in jail. That is the consequence. When you violate a court's order, a fine and jail is what you get. You are held in contempt. And to me, that is frightening and I think improper. And I think judges are the first line of defense. It shouldn't have to be the Supreme Court who does this. It should be trial court judges who recognize the limits of their own authority and tailor these in a way that doesn't lead to this. And hopefully we see more of that. Now, look, I know, like if Bob Motto was here, I know what he would say. He would say, but the defendant doesn't get to speak and his lawyers don't get to speak. So if the victims are getting to speak, that's unfair. I totally get that. I get that. But there has to be some limit to this. We are trying to protect the fairness of the trial, but that it is a balance. We are balancing things. And just like it shouldn't go all the way in favor of free speech, who cares about the defendant's rights? It shouldn't go all the way in favor of the defendant's rights. Who cares about the rights of the victims to have free speech? And you have to balance that, and we need to do a better job of that, I think, is my sort of takeaway from what we talked about today.
And I think what you can get from all of this is these are very complex issues. And judges, I'm not jealous of what they have to deal with in balancing these rights. So we're not saying that these judges are wrong to do it. These gag orders have been used, and sometimes when you don't know what else to do, you think you have to use a gag order. But these are very, very complex issues that we have to think more about, and maybe outside of the context of specific cases, kind of writ large, what this means for our society and what we need to ensure fair trials and to protect constitutional rights, which we believe are very important. And you will maybe get a pocket constitution the next time you see us. But with all of that, I mean, on this topic, Brett, is there anything you'd like to add before we maybe answer some questions?
Well, I'm really interested in everybody's thoughts and comments on this topic. It's a fascinating topic. It's one that I think is not talked about enough. You sort of see these gag orders. I think one problem is we just accept them. They come out and everybody's like, oh, well, there's a gag order. We now have to operate under that. And I like it when I see various media entities banding together to sue, to try and prevent this from happening. We saw this. There were some lawsuits in Delphi. I think our friends at the Murder Sheet were involved in some of those to get some of the documents released. You know, even the mandamus by the old defense, even though we all know that was meant to set up the mandamus that really mattered. Nevertheless, what they were seeking was a good thing, to try and get this information out into the public. And it is a balance. I get it. It's hard. We've talked about this with cameras in the courtroom and how that is a balance as well. And there is a cost to everything you do. And figuring that cost out, I'm not saying it's easy, but it is something that needs to be grappled with. And I feel like we don't grapple with it enough. So I probably said enough. I'll probably leave that. I'll leave it there.
That's great. So do we have time for some questions?
Absolutely. We got Legal Briefs questions lining up. And I have this one. I really want to know Alice's answer to this question. So I have to ask this question.
All right.
This is from Aaron4113. And Aaron wants to know, is Texas the South? Discuss.
Oh, that is a question that gets all the time. So, no, Texas is Texas. The South is something else. And now that I've lived in Texas and I've lived in the South, I can attest to that. Texas is its own thing, man. It really is.
So my counter arguments to that, I think that's probably right. But the counter arguments you often hear to it are, well, the first one, what people would say in the past is, how are you defining the South? If you define the South by the Civil War, Texas was in the Confederacy, so therefore Texas is part of the South. I define the South by football. And for a long time, that meant Texas wasn't in the South. But now both Texas A&M and Texas are in the SEC. And if you're in the Southeastern Conference, then by definition, you're the South, right? Like, I mean, I'm sorry. Sorry, North Carolina and Virginia, you're out.
So by
Texas,
football,
you're in.
but by culture, man, the fact that Texas is on its own grid, is the Republic of Texas, and could secede at any moment, and is perhaps the last shining moment if we were to break away from the United States. It is not the South in so many ways, and it's an intangible. It's not a negative on anyone, the North or the South. Texas is just so unique that, I've lived in the Northeast, I've lived in the South. I've not lived in the West, but I have family who live in the West, so I go out there a good bit. And there is just nothing like Texas.
Let me give the counter argument.
And perhaps, yeah, you already gave a counter.
Well, this is the counter argument. So this is me agreeing with you.
Okay.
So I would agree with Alice in that. In order to be a southern state, you must have great barbecue. Texas doesn't. Therefore, Texas is not a southern state.
Oh, you did not just go there. No. I will say that I didn't know what everyone else called barbecue until after I left Texas, because you're right. We called barbecue something else, and I still count, like the Salt Lake brisket and Franklin barbecue. And then I came out to like South Carolina. I was like, what is this saucy thing that you have? I think Texas barbecue is just like the greatest cuts of meat where you've just killed the meat yourself, the animal yourself, and just like throwed it on Barbie, and that is good brisket. But look, I love the South. I love Texas. But being a Texan, there's just a level of pride there. You are not lumped. And I think that's the other part is, even if Texas was part of the South, you would never describe yourself from the South. So I would go with descriptor. You'd be like, where are you from? I'm from Texas. Right. Whereas most people who come from like a lot of the Bible Belt, I think, would say the South if they're in the Northeast, for example, because the South is kind of a swath of land for those in the Northeast. But if you're in the Northeast or anywhere else in the world, you say Texas.
As annoying as people from Texas are and their like uniqueness, I do feel like Texas is one of those places. This is a great thing about the United States. There's so many places that are just so unique. I mean, Louisiana is in the South, but Louisiana is unlike anywhere else in the country.
Right.
And Texas has the same feel. Texas has that sort of unique feeling. I mean, the people of Oklahoma might disagree. I feel like Oklahoma and Texas, even though they hate each other, have a lot in common as well.
Poor Oklahoma. I didn't know that Oklahoma was actually a pretty good place until I left Texas and had, the veil lifted from my eyes. I was like, we don't hate Oklahoma. Yeah. What do you know?
There you go. Okay.
Oh, my goodness.
So that was a controversial one. But a great question. Thank you, Aaron.
Great one.
Okay. I'll now answer. This question is more directed at me, so I'll answer this one. This is from Jay Mosey. What is your opinion of the addition of NIL in college football? So I have mixed opinions on NIL. Number one, I'm really glad that players are able to make money while they're in college. And I think back to some of the great players that I saw who either just didn't make it in the NFL, or worse, were injured in some way in college and were never able to play in the NFL. And I wish that they had played under the current system. There's an Alabama player named Tyrone Prothro who was amazing and suffered just a catastrophic. He would have been a wide receiver in the NFL. There's no question. Would have made a lot of money. Suffered a catastrophic injury during a game and never recovered from it. And it's nice to know that now those kids are at least going to get some money. I like that. My concerns are, number one, when you see an 18-year-old drive up to the football facility in a Lamborghini, you worry that a lot of the same problems that a lot of NFL players run into with money are now going to happen even earlier when these kids have even less sort of self-control and ability to handle this. The problem I see is NIL is so unregulated and just completely free-for-all. I'm a big capitalist, but it reminds me of the fall of the Soviet Union. How the Soviet Union falls and what you end up with is oligarchies, right? You know, it's not an actual capitalist society. It's an oligarchical society where people basically captured all this stuff and made tons of money off of it. And there's all sorts of negatives about that. I think NIL is going to have the same thing. You're going to see a lot of negatives. Obviously, I hate the fact that college football has lost a lot of what made it special. You know, it is a money game now, and it's not about, to the extent it ever was, but I think there was more sort of loyalty to schools, all that stuff. You add that in with a transfer portal. Now you have, I mean, people can tell you how much a quarterback's going for in the transfer portal. And there's a professionalizing of college football that feels kind of icky. I have no idea what the answer is to balance all that out or to make it more fair or to ensure that everybody on the team is getting a slice. The other thing, Title IX, you know, in college sports, and this is really going down the rabbit hole now, in college sports, you're supposed to have equality between women's sports and men's sports. And the way we've done that in the past is to ensure that there are as many scholarships for women as there are for men. And you know, college football often funds all the scholarships for all the various sports. Well, with NIL coming in, is that a problem? Because obviously, you know, I don't think this is me being sexist to say this, the men's sports are going to command more NIL than the women's sports. And a lot of these NIL come from collectives. And how is that going to play in? And is that going to be a problem? I don't know. I just think there's so many issues. I am happy on the one hand that these kids are making money, but there is a lot going on behind the scenes, and I have no idea how to solve it. What do you think, Alice?
No, this is actually, I mean, I agree with you. It's a very complex issue. I mean, it stinks, right, that you have these colleges that at one point were capturing although they were not always capturing all of the money. You know, there was a lot of things going to the athletes, but I think when you have an 18-year-old who becomes just a dollar sign to the community, the school community, to the people around them, that's really difficult and a lot to shoulder for an 18-year-old. And a lot of, you know, college coaches have said that they don't want to coach professional football for that very reason, because you lose control in a lot of ways as a coach when your players are, you know, driving Lamborghinis and they do what they want. And there's just, I mean, there is the love of the game, and there is so much to being a student athlete that I think is just out the window at that point, that there's not even going to be a balance, that you could potentially get an education, because who wants to get an education? You know, you're going to get the cash in earlier on and potentially never finish your degree. I don't know. I just, as a Tiger mom, you know, I care about these 18-year-olds, and I think there is a lot that we will lose for these kids. They are kids. I don't know that the answer is to not allow them to monetize at all.
Okay, one last question, and then we'll go. That was
Yes.
deep. We could do an entire legal briefs on that. Probably should. This is from Stephanie. I'm going to start with you, Alice. Who is your favorite stand-up comedian?
Oh, easy. Mike Birbiglia. I like a lot of comedians. I watch all of, you know, the specials, and I always go back to Mike Birbiglia because he is, I think, one of the most genius storytellers. He is not a punchline comedian, but he is a laugh out loud for the whole hour and a half set, or however long his sets are, because you can see his story arc. But the whole thing's a joke. So there's like jokes, and then there's the arc of the jokes, and there's like different arcs of the joke, and it just keeps arcing. It's like a rainbow of jokes. I think he's on NPR a lot. He's friends with Ira Glass, so he's on, like, you know, they take his bits a lot of times for NPR stories. He's had a couple of movies made now, and we've seen him. He was on Broadway for a while, I think, called The New One. But I love him. I think he is a smart comedian, and if you don't know him, you should definitely check him out. I think he has lots of Netflix specials. One really quick story. We love him, so we go see him live whenever we can. And it was after we had my 6-year-old. We had bought tickets because we, didn't have a baby before that. We're like, easy. My due date is 3 days before this show. We can absolutely make it. Either I'll go super pregnant or the baby will be here, so they'll just be sleeping and we'll go to the show. So we bought these tickets 6 months in advance. And come time for the show, we had a 3-day-old, and we were we gotta go to the show. It doesn't matter. We barely got out of the hospital. I was like, let's go to the show. Had a grandparent care for the baby, and those of you who have a 3-day-old know it's impossible to leave at all. I was wearing sweatpants. It was great.
Should have just taken the baby.
He was not sleeping for sure, so he was very loud, and we're we can do this. We got an Uber, we got in the car. I was wearing sweatpants. Who knows what was happening? We're we're gonna make it, it's gonna be awesome. We have our tickets and we make it to the theater, and this is downtown, so we had Ubered. There's nowhere to park. It was freezing, it was snowing, it was ice. I didn't have the proper footwear because my feet were too big, and we show up to the theater and there's a long line. I'm we made it, it's okay. And we wait in line, it's sleeting on us, and we get to the front and they scan our tickets. And the guy was your tickets are no good. And I'm we didn't even scalp them. We bought them from the Mike Birbiglia website. What do you mean? And he looked at my tickets. He's yeah, your show's tomorrow. But for Mike Birbiglia, I did it, and we went out the next night.
Nice. That's awesome. That's awesome.
What
That's a
about you?
great pregnancy story. Mine is easy. Mitch Hedberg. He's awesome. Rest in peace.
Oh,
Those of you youngsters out there who have never heard Mitch Hedberg, go on YouTube, find his stuff, listen to it. He's amazing. He's amazing. Gone too soon. No question.
He is gone too soon. I think in my life I quote him so much that I forget it's from him. Because I'll be yeah, where did that come from? And I'll go look it up, and I'm oh, it's Mitch.
Every time I go somewhere and buy a donut and they give me a receipt, I always think of Mitch Hedberg. Am I going to return this donut? Do I need a receipt? Yeah, he was great.
Yeah, he was absolutely great.
So if you enjoyed that and you want your question answered, write us a 5-star review either on the Prosecutors or Prosecutors Legal Briefs. Just want to say to whoever hate listens to the show and asked whether or not Brittany is really Alice's daughter's name, you left a 1-star review. So guess what? We're not going to answer your question. So if you want to have your question answered, leave a 5-star review.
Wow. With that said, thank you guys for tuning in. Let us know what you thought about today's episode. If you have any thoughts for Legal Briefs episode, we always love to hear it. You can email us at prosecutorspod@gmail.com. Reach out to us at prosecutorspod on X, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all of the social medias. We are there and we read your messages. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutors Legal Briefs.
Hello, everyone.
And hello, everybody. Hello. It's been a heck of a day.
Yeah.
You sound like you had a busy day.
We've been very busy. And then you and I were talking to people.
Busy too. Yeah. Are you busy because you're traveling or because of work?
Well, we're in the process of hiring people. So.
Ew.
Yeah. So
That's hence the interview.
Doing interviews.
That always takes up so much time.
It does. Mm-hmm. But
I hope there are some good candidates
there were some good
that
ones.
can replace Alice.
Yeah, I don't know about that.